Good afternoon, everybody. I see a lot of people are just beginning to log in. We had a ton of interest in this webinar. Over 160 people registered, and so we usually get a pretty good turnout from that. The webinar will be recorded as well and posted on the Cord SlideShare and YouTube channel. So if you know some colleagues who missed it, please feel free to let them know that that will be available afterwards. But for those of you who are on the line, please get your questions ready. We've got a great lineup today of folks who are very aware of what's happened over the last few years on the changes to the patented medicines regulations and the proposed reforms to the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. So my name is Bill Dempster, CEO of 360 Public Affairs, and work closely with the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. Cord has been running a number of webinars over the summer, and many of you have come out to those. And we're looking forward to doing more in the coming months. I'll certainly let the head of Cord, once I introduce her, tell you more about some upcoming events as well in Toronto that Cord will be leading on. So today's webinar is called Debunking the Myths of the New Regulations on Prescription Drug Pricing Controls. We've got myself, and I'll run through a few slides. Neil Palmer, Principal of PDCI Market Access, and many of you know Neil. He's a Senior Strategic Advisor and founder of PDCI Market Access, pricing and reimbursement consultancy based here in Ottawa. His current role at PDCI is to provide strategic advice and expertise to clients on pricing and market access matters, more than just in Canada. Neil spends a lot of time in Europe. I think he's off to California soon to teach in university there on pricing globally. So, and he's also held a senior role at the PMPRB in the early days. Durhan Wang Rieger also doesn't need much of an introduction. President and CEO of Cord, also chair of Consumer Advocare Network and Canadian Heart Patient Alliance, etc. Like Neil, she's often on an airplane and interacting with people around the world. And Durhan, I'll certainly let you explain a little bit about what these pricing regs have engendered in terms of conversations that you've had overseas and elsewhere in terms of what's happening in Canada. And I don't think I want to waste any more time except for to thank Innomar for hosting this webinar and letting us use their GoToWebinar service. It's a real asset to Cord to be able to have Jennifer and Jessica be able to help put these on. So thank you very much for that. And with that, I think we should get started. Get your questions ready. Start asking them as soon as we start, because we're going to leave 15 minutes at the end so that folks can really get their say in and hopefully have some good questions for us. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes recapping a little bit about the PMPRB. It's a quasi-judicial federal agency based here in Ottawa. It regulates medication prices well under patent. If there's any patent associated with the medicine, then that falls under the scope of the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. It reports to the Federal Health Minister, although it's part of their mandate is part of the Patent Act, which is the rest of the Patent Act is actually the mandate of the Minister for Innovation, Science and Economic Development, and it does two things. One is regulatory. It ensures that prices charged by patentees for patented medicines sold in Canada are not excessive, and that's a really key word that we'll talk a little bit more about later. And second, it reports. It tracks pricing trends, and that's for both patented medicines and generic medicines, as well as R&D spending. And it classifies medicines based on the level of therapeutic improvement and applies different tests based on that to determine whether a price is excessive in Canada. It also regulates the ex-factory price, not the consumer price. So what you pay in a pharmacy is maybe very different from what the price the wholesaler or the distributor would pay when it comes off of the pallet in the U.S. or wherever it's manufactured. And finally, a PMPRB approval of price is not required before sale. So some of you heard me say before, it's like a roadside traffic cop. If you're speeding, they'll pull you over, but you can drive without actually getting things reviewed. Just drive carefully because they've got a big book of tickets that they like to give out. Back in the late 80s, when the PMPRB came into being in 1987, it was a relatively straightforward path between drug development and patient access. There was Health Canada review, the PMPRB, and then there was some reviews by the provincial drug plans, but generally it was pretty quick patient access. That's changed today. So fast forward, 30 years, and there are dozens of organizations that review prices throughout the whole system. And I won't go into this in any detail, just to say that things certainly have changed, and I think that my co-presenters will talk about the role that the CADIF and the HTA play, for example, in advising on prices, and even private drug plans have formulary management systems as well. So there are lots of organizations that do review and have a price moderating effect. As I said, it imposes a maximum non-excessive price by applying tests, breakthrough, substantial improvement, moderate improvement, or no or little improvement, and different price tests will be applied depending on which category it falls into. In fact, it's kind of funny, not that funny really, but you can get a breakthrough and then you're at the median international price based on the basket of countries to the right, but sometimes a substantial improvement can actually yield a better price. So it might look like you end up with very, very few breakthrough drugs, but it might just be because you might achieve a better price if you're actually classified as a substantial improvement. One of the current rules also is that the prices of the patented medicines can never exceed the international maximum price, which is the highest among those countries that we've got to the right there on the screen. The price can never, as I said, never be higher than the highest international price. The maximum allowable price is set at launch. You can take annual price increases, and they're limited to the consumer price index increase, and in most cases, they're not taken at all. And there are regular reporting requirements for manufacturers twice a year, and it's divided into 4 market segments that you can see there. And the enforcement for non-compliance is very serious. The PMPRB can undertake investigations, and if they allege or suspect that there's non-compliance with the rules, they can issue a board order. The PMPRB can issue a board order, and the staff itself can actually negotiate a voluntary compliance undertaking. Those have actually yielded millions of dollars in VCU payments that come into general revenues at the federal level and are often distributed to the provinces. In fact, recently, a lot of that money has gone to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, tens of millions of dollars. So finally, if the board order is not complied with, or if a VCU cannot be achieved, then there can be a board order, but that can be appealed to the federal court by the patentee that's questioning it. So what's happened over the last, I should say, 3 years, but we're gonna make that really much shorter and talk about the last month or so. After 2.5 years or I'd even say 3 years of discussions and consultations and considerations, final changes to the patented medicines regulations were made. And there were very few substantive differences compared to the proposals that were put forward in December 2017. So they were released on August 9th, and they will come into force on July 1st, 2020. And here's just a tweet that the health minister put out saying, that the staff at the PMPRB are going to have a lot of work to do and new tools to do it. So what happened on August 9th with that announcement? And well, all medicines, including those currently marketed in Canada, will be subject to the new basket, which they're calling the PMPRB 11, and that will begin as of July 1st, 2020. The December 2017 draft regulations did propose adding South Korea. They did not add South Korea. And the new basket would take out the US and Switzerland and add these 6 new countries: Belgium, Norway, Japan, Spain, the Netherlands, and Australia. And I'll let Neil explain what that means in terms of the price test that they're proposing to move forward with and the new PMPRB basket. They also move forward with a new economic criteria that's mandatory application of this criteria to determine maximum non-excessive prices for new medicines. And that includes pharmacoeconomic value, so a cost per quality adjusted life year. If it costs more than a certain threshold that they will establish through guidelines, then the patentee may have to pay back the amount that would be charged more over that threshold. There are also market size adjustments. If there are forecasted or actual sales that are above a certain amount, price adjustments maybe have to be taken. And then they're looking for a gross domestic product and GDP per capita. It looks like they're asking for that information, or at least moving forward on that basis to screen in certain medicines for review and the use of the pharmacoeconomic value, which I think we'll get into in a second. These new economic criteria are only going to apply to medicines that are assigned a drug identification number after August 21st. So there is grandfathering for older medicines, or at least older DINs. We don't know, and one of the issues that we might talk about is, an older medicine could get a new DIN in terms of a new formulation. So the same medicine might have different prices depending on when it got its DIN issued by Health Canada. The new reporting obligations to support the board's ability to enforce the new criteria. They will require patentees to report net prices after rebate under product listing agreements, free goods, etc. They also want to see forecasts of estimated maximum use of medicines within the first 30 days of the first sale. And then they have additional reporting requirements for high-cost medicines, and this is mainly on that cost per quality threshold that I talked about before. A high-cost med in Health Canada's perspective is a medicine that costs more than 50% of Canada's annual GDP per capita, and that's about $24,000 or $25,000 per year. And if you hit that threshold, there will be a requirement to proactively report all published, publicly developed cost utility analysis, and that's that cost per quality threshold. And I know I'm speaking a little bit of technical jargon here. Feel free in the question and answers boxes to ask a little bit more. I'll definitely leave that to Neil to go into and to Durhan. The estimated savings that Health Canada is forecasting is $8.8 billion in net present value over the next 10 years on patented drug costs. And that's almost identical to what they forecast in December 2017 in their budget impact analysis. And interestingly, the model used by Health Canada to estimate that impact really capped the potential use of the economic factors. And so, I just find it interesting that they use different formulas depending on who they're talking to about this entire package. And how it's going to be used in practice is what we're really going to get into very shortly. Health Canada also issued a fact sheet and a regulatory impact analysis statement with noting that the amendments will not reduce or delay access to new innovative medicines, and saying that there are peer countries that have faster access and greater levels of investment despite lower prices. And there's been a lot of analysis that has been done on that at the global level and recently in Canada that actually show that there is a demonstrated relationship between lower regulated prices for pharmaceuticals and lower levels of R&D and access. And again, we'll get into that a bit shortly. The fact sheet also claimed that the changes are similar to or drawn directly from those in place in other countries, including those with pharmaceutical industries. But in fact, there is no other jurisdiction in the world that uses economic factors to regulate the sale price for the entire market for any sale. And it is questionable about whether a quasi-judicial federal regulatory body should be determining the affordability for all payers, which arguably falls within the purview of provincial governments, other payers, and individuals. So with that, that was a brief, hopefully not too rapid fire, but I'll hand it over to Neil to talk through the impact of the price reforms on product launches in Canada.
Great, thanks very much, Bill. I have a few slides to go through. Some of you folks that were on one of the previous, you'll recognize some of them, but certainly there's some new ones given the new, the finally published regulations and our anticipation of how they may be applied. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how drug manufacturers set prices. And for manufacturers, most of them are of course multinational corporations, and many of them have what are sometimes called global pricing teams. And when they're going to launch new products around the world, they get together and they try and understand, well, what are the potential prices they could get in each market, along with a variety of other factors that would inform their desire to enter that market. And if you look at, in Canada, for example, they would look at the pricing that would be allowed by the PMPRB. They would look at the recommendations from CADA, CDR, or PCODER, as well as INES. What the public and private plans, are they likely going to reimburse it? What the net effective price might be once negotiated with the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, or PCPA, and what's the timing of all of that. And from that, they will gather this type of information from every country, and then try and decide what is the optimal way, the best way to launch the medicine, sequencing it, typically starting with high-price countries and then moving towards lower-price markets. And so this is an example here of a spreadsheet at the lower right-hand corner is from the folks at the statistical social, I can't remember what stats stands for, but it's a statistical package. And they have designed a whole module to help manufacturers set prices and optimize launch sequencing in various markets. And on the left, you'll see the who references who in terms of international reference pricing, something that incidentally started in Canada in 1987 with the creation of the PMPRB. But most countries now use some form of international reference pricing. So there's a whole cottage industry that's sprung up trying to develop these tools to help manufacturers optimize their product launch sequencing. The countries that don't currently reference international prices are the UK, Sweden, the United States, although even in the US now and for Medicare Part B drugs, there's a proposed rule where they would start referencing other countries, including Canada. And so all of this, all to say is that the prices in Canada matter, and they matter in terms of when drugs are going to be launched in Canada. As it stands now, and this is the slide you see now is analysis that was done by a company called Cutting Edge Information in 2016, looking at the launch sequencing preferences from the companies they surveyed. The dark blue you see, that would be a first wave of launches. So they would either call them a phase launch or waves, first wave launch. And so the U.S. is almost always there. It would have to be a European or some kind of foreign company if the product wasn't launched first in the U.S. And then you'll see a group of Germany, Canada, and the U.S., which have a large proportion of medicines launched first where they're in the first wave of launches. And if they're not in the first, then they're invariably in the second wave of launches. And so this is very important, and this is well established. This isn't theory. This isn't something that the industry has made up. This is how the industry operates. So if we look at the new complex guideline framework that the PMPRB announced, and this is that's something that evolved over the last year and a half, starting with a scoping document that they released in December of 2017 and all through 2018 and through this year in terms of steering committees and working groups and that kind of thing. And this is the kind of thing that evolved in anticipation of the regulations that were published last month. Now, the thing that has changed a little bit is the criteria for category 1, which are high priority, high risk drugs, depending on what you want to call them. They have these market size and average annual cost per capita GDP as ways of identifying high priority drugs. And category 2, everybody else would be a low priority drug. I think the important element is it all begins with what they call the median international price. And you see in the middle column in the second second bar in that middle column, MIPC. So everybody gets set to the MIPC of the PMPRB 11. It used to be 12, as Bill mentioned. South Korea's gone. And then the next step is either go over to high priority or low priority, and then set prices from there. So all this is pretty complicated. So I've got another slide coming up in a minute that's going to make it look a little more, simplify it a little bit. If you look at the slide, and this is a slide that's from the PMPRB's annual report in 2017, it looks at international prices. This is IQVIA data that PMPRB has published. And you can see the light blue bars are the prices, are the current PMPRB 7 reference countries. You can see Canada in red and the OECD median in dark blue. And the position the government has had for some time, and it's in their latest fact sheet, is that Canadian prices are 85% higher than the OECD median. That's one of their rationale for moving forward with all these price reductions. And so if we look at what they're going to do, they are now have these new countries, and you can see that those little bars that are coming down, the blue is a new comparator, and the orangey ones are the current comparators that are going to stay as part of the PMPRB 11. And the impact of all that is, of course, the median of these 11 countries, we call the PMPRB 11, now closely aligns with the OECD median. Now, the OECD median is 0.81, and the PMPRB 11 is 0.80 on this, based on this slide. So extremely close. And under the proposed guidelines, Canadian prices are meant to fall to the international median, and then be further reduced, whether that's by the economic factors or the therapeutic class comparison test for low priority medicines, even further. And how this is going to happen, and again, this is an illustration only. We should know in 2 weeks or so from once the draft guidelines are published, and I've had confirmation from senior folks at PMPRB that is going to happen in the next couple of weeks. We will see draft guidelines unless there is something that comes up associated with the election or something, or some kind of political intervention. But in all likelihood, it's high probability that we'll see draft guidelines in the next 2 weeks. So another way to look at all of this is all new medicines have to come in at no more than the PMPRB 11 median price. That's not a rule that exists today. Even on PMPRB 7, the current rule is the highest of the international prices. All medicines would have to come in at the PMPRB 11, and then they would either be high priority or low priority, and these various factors apply. And what we don't know is how they're going to apply them. In the RIAS for high priority drugs, the RIAS being the Regulatory Impact Assessment Statement that accompanied the regulations, and that there was an accompanying cost-benefit analysis, the underlying assumptions were that these factors would be applied, but only to the extent that they didn't have, or the maximum decrease from the median international price would be 50%. They did not provide any detail on the low priority drugs, but we do know from the previous documents produced by PMPRB for the steering committee and the working groups, et cetera, that there is going to be pressure pushed down on those low priority drugs as well. So for purposes of this is what manufacturers see when they see the draft regulations and the other work that PMPRB has been done to date. A reduction from, a starting point of the PMPRB 11, which for most medicines would be considerably lower than they are today, and secondly, up to a 50% reduction from that price based on which factors and how the prices are being put forward. Faced with that kind of information, manufacturers are very reluctant to launch new medicines until they can get some certainty that, in fact, is not going to happen. And we don't have certainly any comfort that that's not the case yet. We may in a couple of weeks once we see the draft guidelines. So Bill, get your name right yet. Bill mentioned that the cost of or the impact of the outlined in the RIAS, the cost-benefit analysis, was $8.8 billion over 10 years. And you can see I've circled that in blue. And that's based on their expected or baseline analysis in terms of what they see the impact being. Now, discount rates is simply a percentage they use to reduce it going forward. It's kind of like a reverse mortgage. But I won't get into the details on that. other than to say if you go to the far right where they don't apply a discount rate, that's just valuing every dollar. Is a dollar 10 years from now is the same as a dollar today. The impact would be, in their baseline case, 13.2 billion, but could go as high as 36.7. In other words, more than 4 times that baseline case of 8.8 billion, and about 3 times the non-discounted rate. So the numbers that industry sees is 36.7 billion, and there's no simple way of understanding what the true impact is going to be until we see the draft guidelines. And even then, there will certainly be a great degree of uncertainty and speculation, and there will certainly be lots of assumptions in terms of how those guidelines will be applied. But that kind of 36.7 billion number is simply going to be unacceptable to many manufacturers. If we look at the impact on drugs for rare diseases, so I mentioned high priority medicines earlier, and so EDRD, expensive drugs for rare diseases, high priority medicines, so these are drugs with annual market size of greater than $20 million. And it would include drugs that have an annual treatment cost of greater than $30,000. Now, Bill mentioned $24,000. That was half the per capita GDP in 2015 when they started that. By the time this comes into force, it's likely going to be about $30,000 would be the new criterion for products that have a cost that's high relative to cost per capita, or GDP per capita rather. So looking at the EDRD, so one of the interesting things here is if you look down, you can see some of the assumptions, and there's more detailed analysis in there, but there's something called the Hollis model. And this Hollis model comes up with a threshold of $4.9 million for annual revenues or expenditures on a particular drug. Now, we don't have a lot of details. This makes some assumptions about the number of patients on average the drug for rare disease would have, et cetera. But when I read the description of the Hollis model in the cost-benefit analysis, it frankly doesn't make a lot of sense. That's not to say that Professor Hollis's model may not be a good model, but certainly the way it's been executed in the cost-benefit analysis, there was no mechanism by which a manufacturer could make any money, any profit at all. In fact, they would always have to sell at a loss, presumably. So it's not clear where they come up with these numbers. So I'll leave it at that. But the bottom line is, with a threshold of 4.9 million, you can see that on average, you just look at the bottom line there, the expensive drugs for rare diseases would experience a 33.4% reduction in their price, or their net effective price. Now, some might say, well, there's probably a discount like that already going to PCPA, and they'll be able to look at that. But that would have to go to the PCPA. Rebates are typically going to the public plans. This would have to go to everybody, and so you can see that there's a significant impact, and that's going to affect the way manufacturers look at this whole process. So going back to that earlier slide where Canada was at, number 3 from the top, this is when you have significant price reductions like that, it's going to push Canada down in launch sequences significantly. And this is just the way the global pharmaceutical market operates. If you're a low-price country, products get launched later. The other issue is the impact of external reference pricing. And so this, again, I mentioned this is an established business practice. Academics at the London School of Economics have looked at this as well and conducted a systematic literature review. That's the highest level of evidence, and concluded that the availability of pharmaceuticals, equitable access to medicines, and the stimulation of industrial policy can be undermined through the use of external reference pricing, or sometimes called international price referencing. So what PMPRB is expanding on now, from a PMPRB 7 to a PMPRB 11, and forcing prices even lower, these effects will be even greater. And secondly, the external reference pricing can trigger spillover effects, resulting in unwillingness of manufacturers to launch in low-price countries.
Neil, just before you move on, would you say Greece and other parts of Europe are examples of this, just to bring it alive? And then
Yes, there's a group of countries in Europe that were sort of jokingly referred to as for Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain were often late. So that what they call the PIGS group, PIGS, were often late because they were often low-price countries. In Greece, because of recent changes, they insist on the lowest price in Europe. And so if you have the lowest price in Europe, the last price of launch. And they depend almost entirely on parallel imports of drugs from other countries because manufacturers aren't willing to actually market the drugs directly in Greece. So the impact on the on rare diseases. So, well, I've talked a lot about the PMPRB 11. In fact, and I think the evidence supports it, that for most drugs for rare disease, that prices are set initially at the median, and there's a fairly tight, what we call pricing corridor. And so, at least initially, we would not see a big impact as a result of the PMPRB 11 versus the PMPRB 7, in part because some of these, in the very low price countries, these drugs won't be launched anyway. So in the near term, that doesn't seem to be a big effect. The big effect for drugs for rare disease is the application of the health economics or cost per quality and the market size. And because there is so much uncertainty in how these particularly the cost per quality is measured, because of small patient populations, that the range of potential impact is difficult to quantify ahead of time. When it's difficult to quantify ahead of time, that means uncertainty for manufacturers, and manufacturers are much less likely to launch if they have very little comfort that they're able to realize a price they can live with. And we saw that from their own analysis, it's a 33% reduction. Now, every product is going to be different, and they've been talking about reductions of 50% for some products. So how PMPRB actually applies these, we don't know. And for example, in earlier draft guidelines, they were talking about never lower than the lowest international price in some scenarios. Well, again, we're pushing everybody to the lower end of the schedule, and that happens. So the overall, the net impact is that prices of new, particularly the new drugs for rare disease, are going to end up between the lowest international price and the median international price. And depending on where it actually falls, is going to significantly impact how quickly these drugs come to market, if they come at all. Secondly, clinical trials will be impacted because manufacturers are uncomfortable conducting clinical trials in countries where they don't anticipate launching the drugs, because they know that once the trial's finished, they've got to keep drugs the patient on drugs essentially forever. And if you're not marketing the drug there, you're not going to have the support systems or anything else. And so in some cases, they won't have a choice because they have to go where the patients are, and drugs for rare diseases, recruitment for patients for clinical trial can be a challenge. But that being said, if they don't have to come to Canada, they may not, because they don't want to have to enter at a very low price. And then finally, one of the things that happens in Canada much more than any other country are the patient support programs for new drugs. Certainly much more than in Europe and in Australia, where the manufacturer pays extensively for supporting the patients, whether it's infusion clinics, nursing support, education, a whole variety of things that doesn't happen in other countries. These programs could be at risk because once the downward pressure continues on prices.
So thanks, Neil. Over to you, Durhan, to walk us through a few facts, myths, and realities.
Thank you very much, and I feel a little challenged trying to follow up with all that data that you've gotten and all of the really hard analysis that you've done. So I'm going to just take us back to some broad strokes and really appreciate the opportunity again to talk from what it means to patients. And I just put it into the, sort of four kind of basic myths and really some real struggles, and maybe some examples to reinforce what both Bill and Neil were talking about, and then hopefully some sense of where we're going. And really, even though, as we say, we're rare diseases, we're not just talking about drugs for rare diseases. We're talking about any innovative therapies. We're talking about any therapy that actually is going to be based on small patient populations. And as we all know, the next wave of therapies coming in are going to be these targeted precision medicines. I think many of you heard or saw, the Globe today really talked about the fact that, we've had significant drops, 60%, better survivals in many of these diseases where precision medicines have come in. And this is where all of the drugs are going, and this is exactly where the PMPRB is targeting that will make it so very difficult for these drugs not only to come into Canada, but as Neil says, in terms of clinical trials. And we're already experiencing it. I mean, despite the fact that it looks like Canada, is actually in that second, third level in terms of list pricing, what we also know is that companies are very concerned by the very long time it takes to get to market, by the significant negotiations that at the end of the day have their list prices really, really substantially lowered to, in many cases, far below what they're getting in other markets. So this is a big challenge for us, currently, but certainly going forward. So, I mean, I just wanted to go through, and then certainly in terms of the PMPRB regulations and their announcements, maybe from our perspective, the patient's perspective, it says, the new PMPRB regulations and guidelines are needed to make medicines more affordable to Canadians. I think one of the things that's very concerning to us is, in fact, that the PMPRB has added to what it considers to be its scope of responsibilities to look at affordability. Nowhere in the mandate of the PMPRB is that the case. And in fact, there's a deliberate attempt, as we all know, to keep the regulatory branch out from having to worry about affordability. And certainly the PMPRB's mandate is to make sure that prices are not excessive. Affordability goes back to the purchaser, and affordability for one purchaser may be quite different than it is for another purchaser, even around the public plans, but certainly when we look at private plans versus public plans. So I think if we end up with, I think what Neil says, if we end up with a severely suppressed or depressed list pricing, it is going to make a real impact in terms of what even, not only drugs are bringing in, but what is going to be deemed as affordability. We are not necessarily saying we love the current system where you've got a list price and then you negotiate it down to an actual price, but that is, I think, as Neil was saying, that's the world we live in. And if Canada is going to say we're going to do something quite different, and that is we're going to set ourselves out as an outlier, where we're going to assure that your list price is going to be down to what is now the affordable price, or now is the negotiated price that the public purchasers want to pay, it is going to make a significant impact. It's just the reality of it. And if we don't want to accept that as the reality of it, we end up with what the scenario is going to be, and that is we won't get access to these drugs. Maybe take the next one. So the myth too is that first, that Canadian price, PMP, the fact is that they're going to impose price controls, if you've already heard, in the reference basket prices, and introduce the pharmacoeconomic factors. So the Canadian prescription drug prices are too high. I think what Neil has already demonstrated is that we already sit within the median in most of these countries. And in fact, our negotiated prices are actually quite, substantially lower than they are in many countries. I mean, and we know in dealing with directly with many of the companies as well, as we as patients are begging them to bring these drugs in, as we are trying to also work with them to say, what can you do to make it so that we can get them listed, not just through the private plans, but through the public plans. We are talking with them all the time about what they can do to help us. And as much as we're advocating on one side for the plans to actually be able to increase their drug lists and also to increase their budgets to allocate for them, we are significantly talking to the companies. I mean, we've had certainly some of the drug plans say to us, and I remember very, very early on when we had the first rare disease drugs coming into Canada, people says, why can't you talk to the manufacturers and get them to lower the prices? We are already talking to manufacturers. We are already talking about what it would take to make sure that these drugs can get into Canada. We have no reason to want to pay more than we need to, or more than drug plans are willing to pay. So yeah, it's to our advantage. So we already know that at the end of the day, Canada is not paying the highest prices when we talk about what the actual price that we're paying, as opposed to what that list price is. Do we like the fact that they're not transparent? Do we like the fact that they have to be negotiated? Not necessarily, but again, we say it's the reality of it. And we also know that at the end of the day, the Canadians are able to do a great deal. Neil also said something which is, I mean, it's not really a dirty secret, but it's kind of a dirty secret, and that is, yes, the private plans pay more than the public plans for, you know, some of the same medicines. And yes, if we introduce much lower list prices, it means the private plans may in fact be paying a lot lower than they are currently. What that will mean is that the public plans are going to have to be paying more in order to assure that we're going to end up with something in Canada as around an average pricing that is going to make it so that companies want to come in. This is a challenge, and I have said to some of the public plan managers, the provinces, you know, you do know that this means that the price of drugs for public plans are going to have to come up. And we have had response back when they're truly being honest, say, yeah, we know that's going to happen, and we're willing to accept that. So, you know, is that where we want to go? Is that really what we're looking for? And when we hear national, you know, the proposal for national pharmacare saying the only way we can have national pharmacare is that we're going to have to lower the price of all the drugs, I guess that's the question we want to ask. Is that the trade-off that we as patients want to make? Is that the most reasonable payoff, that we're going to try to introduce them at very low list prices, be among the last to get access to these drugs? And yes, we may end up with, I think, the same net prices as that we're having currently. The system we have today isn't perfect. Canada is doing, I think, what is really reasonable in terms of being able to attract them. I think the downside of what these regulations will introduce is that we could be very much at a losing end of it. And I think, as Neil says, no other country introduces the pharmacoeconomic factor into their list pricing. And if we do it, we will definitely be putting Canadians at a disadvantage. The next slide, please. So the myth 3, the impact of the regulations on access to new medicines. I think we've had all of this over and over again. And certainly what the PMPRB and Health Canada is saying, there's no evidence of a link, that these changes need not and will not hamper the ability of Canadian patients not only to get access to drugs to be in clinical trials. I read that when I saw the opinion piece, and these are physicians that we respect a great deal, and I was very, very saddened by it, because they're either being naive about the whole thing or they're just being obstinate. I don't know which it is. Quite frankly, they know that we do not actually get access to all the clinical trials. We do not get our patients involved. And what we don't get are clinical trial sites in Canada, even today, because there is a concern about how long it takes to get their drugs onto market. If we, in fact, have an even greater impact on that, we know what will happen. And it's not the physicians that are chasing these companies to get clinical trials. It's not these physicians that are chasing the developers to say, please set up your clinical trials here. We need to have patients here. It's not, they're not the ones that are helping the patients to get to the US or to other environments to take part in clinical trials that they hear about in other jurisdictions, because they're not here in Canada. This is, in fact, what is happening. We're actually kind of lucky here in Canada because so many clinical trials take place in the US. Our patients can get there. They learn about it from their other patient groups that are down there. They learn about it through clinicaltrials.gov. And so then they find it. And sometimes they actually have to fight with the clinicians to actually get access to these trials because the clinicians themselves will not be aware of them. So we really are already at a disadvantage. And it's sad that, we don't have clinicians that are standing up and saying, what can we do to do more in getting the clinical trials here? And are basically suggesting that, no, there's no impact. We're not going to be able to have to worry about it. What we know is that countries like Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Spain, and all of the Latin American countries, they have considerably lower list prices. They have considerably longer, delays to access. And we also know then that they actually don't get the clinical trials. We're lucky here in some respects because we can't spill over into the US because we have done some jobs in terms of being able to make them accessible here. But what we know is that if we do this, Neil is absolutely right. We hear it openly from all the companies. I was just on a trip through Taiwan and Korea, basically, funnily enough, as a Canadian ambassador to engage companies that are developing drugs there. And more drugs are being developed by, companies overseas. Drugs for rare diseases as well, to get them to come to Canada, bring the drugs to Canada, set up clinical trials in Canada, provide research and development opportunities here, set up offices here in Canada. And the first words out of people's mouths over a dozen companies I'm visiting is, what about these PMPRB? We don't think we want to come, given what this might mean. What is happening in terms of reimportation? We don't think we want to come. And we know that there are a number of companies that have drugs that's almost hovering in the air, ready to come into Canada, and they're not going going to launch them until they get some sense of what these regulations mean. So we know firsthand that these are, in fact, real barriers in terms of clinical trials and access. Next one. And finally, open and transparent consultations. I have to finish off with this. PMB says they're going to set up a new open and transparent dialogue with Canadians on these changes. They've been in consultation with Canadians since 2016, blah, blah, blah. I mean, as some of you will know, I sat on the steering committee for the implementation of the guidelines, and I will say that none of those consultations were meaningful. And in fact, there are many, many examples in which we put forth ideas, we put forth suggestions, we put forth analyses that were never taken up on, that were never followed through. I mean, you look at the kind of analysis that Neil has done, nobody within the PMPRB was willing to accept any of those analyses, was willing to reconsider what it is that they put off. It is not surprising at the end of almost 2 years of consultations, we end up exactly the same part as we started, because all suggestions, all ideas, were actually either pushed back or they were, quite frankly, biased and set up in such a way, even, to reinforce what they were saying. I mean, the easiest example was the Dodge report, which Health Canada points to and says, yes, this reinforces what we're doing. You read the Dodge report, it does not say that at all. You look at their cost and benefits analysis, it does not say what it is that they're trying to do, or they will reposition it. It's very, very sad. The technical report that came out, again, the misrepresentation of it, and yet the unwillingness to actually acknowledge it. I'll leave it at there because I really, feel that we need to do something entirely different going forward. And we are realizing that by having, I think, just stepped into the consultations that were open to us, we actually were not able to make the kind of impact that we wanted. I think we're all at risk, not just rare diseases, but if we're looking at innovative therapies and the new medicines that are coming in, especially those that are precision medicines that, everybody touts as being the lifeline for many of these even chronic diseases, we're not going to have them. We're not going to be able to get them in the way that we need to. So we are going to have to open up a different set of consultations that will allow us to be able to do and to be able to put together the information we want. And I think over the next, 11 months, we're going to have to force, Health Canada, the PMPRB, to actually acknowledge what it is that we're saying, to make sure that these guidelines are not going to come out in such a way that all of our, even not, never mind our worst case scenario, even the most mild, implementations could have such a negative impact. So we have to find ways of working together to make sure that there is listening to, and that there is an ability to keep what is first and foremost, and that is that Canadians get access to these drugs, and they get access to them early, they get access to them in ways that are going to not disadvantage the patients who need them.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Durhan, and thanks, Neil, as well, for walking us through some of the impacts from where you're sitting. The line is open in terms of the text box for questions, and lots of attendees are on, and I know that there are many of you that are not wallflowers that have a lot of really important questions to bring forward, so please do so. I'm going to start with one while you're getting ready to type in, and that's around case studies. I think that the case studies that the PMPRB came up with, they came out in December of 2018, relatively far into the process in terms of the guidelines steering committee that you referenced, Durhan. And there were some external case studies that were done as well, trying to run through the models that the PMPRB has proposed to use to implement the regulations. How important were those case studies in terms of highlighting the potential impacts? Because it seems like there's a disconnect between, for instance, the cost-benefit analysis that you referenced, Neil, 33% potential impact on rare diseases, and upwards of 90% if you actually run through the model. What is the value of case studies, and on a go-forward basis, is that something that we should think about in terms of evaluating this proposed model? And maybe, Durhan, to your point, different models for achieving access. I don't know who wants to start on that one.
I can start. So the case studies are important from two perspectives. One, to test underlying assumptions about what the impact might be. And I think the steering committee, particularly the folks from PMPRB and so the provinces, were shocked when they found out that some of the criteria they were talking about for what were high priority medicines, they assumed it would only be a few, less than 10% of products would qualify, when in fact it was close to 90% based on a cost per quality qualifier or criterion. And they had to recognize that their assumption was wrong, which goes to show that really a lot of this exercise in terms of development has been based has been theoretical as opposed to practical. And case studies help you get to the practical. And so it takes you through and you can see some of the potential impacts. The second part of it is, so there's that, and as someone who used to work there, and as someone who's, for decades now, help manufacturers work their way through how PMPRB applies its guidelines. How do you actually implement this stuff? Implementing it by din or drug by drug, as opposed to at an average level and given certain assumptions, etc. When you actually have to do it for drug by drug, all of a sudden you encounter all kinds of challenges that you didn't think of when you're just looking at it as a conceptual exercise. And I think Bill mentioned earlier about a line extension. They're talking about DINs that came on the market prior to August 21st, 2019 have the old rules. Ones that come after are the new rules. So you're going to have a product that has a medicine that has 3 DINs or strengths dosage forms on the market as of August 21st. They launch a new one in September, and it's going to apply the new rules. How in the world will that work? How have no one's thought about that at all. And that's going to introduce some real practicalities, some real challenges in terms of how practical all this is. I don't know if Durhan, you have any comments to add to that?
Yeah, well, we were on the steering committee, and when we asked for the case studies because we really felt like, just speaking about these in a vacuum, we're not going to be helpful. So we asked for case studies. They developed a set of case studies. And I think, as Neil says, I think people were actually shocked in terms of what the case study said. What they assumed we're going to be, and what they had said initially is that we're looking for a 20% reduction. That would get us to something like the OECD medium. What some of these models showed is that you're going to be asking companies to come up with a 90% reduction. And they took it to say, oh my gosh, that means that, these drugs, should not have been ever priced at that. What we were not, given the opportunity to really look at is what did that really mean and where did those come from? Quite frankly, we need to do case studies, but the only way they're going to be helpful is if we can do them openly, if we can do them transparently, if we can talk about it. I mean, when you sit in the steering committee and you're surrounded by, people who are not going to be flexible in terms of looking at these and debating them honestly, I can tell you it was the most tortured experience I ever had, sitting in those meetings where, comments were made, reflections were given, objections were raised, and it kept being pushed back. There were never really dialogues. None of the case studies were ever truly debated. None of them were ever kind of, sort of really torn apart to really see what made a difference. And then there were other case studies that were introduced that were never really discussed. And I think this is the challenge that we have. And the technical committee that was supposedly looking at whether or not the assumptions of the PMPRB were accurate, were never really given the case studies to actually say, okay, what do you think? How does this work from your expertise point of view? So yeah, I think case studies would be important. And I think what we learned from even what they presented was those case studies show some very, very devastating scenarios, but what those mean and how we need to change what it is that we're proposing to do in terms of the learnings on those case studies were never, ever, ever taken into consideration. We use the case studies. What did we learn? Well, nobody actually was able to, get any kind of real learnings into the proposed regulations.
And thanks for that, Durhan. This is a related question to sort of so what and what next. The federal election is going to happen on October 21st, and national pharmacare is very likely going to be, the number 1 or number 2 social policy issue of the parties, along with climate change. What do these regulations mean for the concept of national pharmacare in your perspectives? And what would you like to tell all of the parties going into this election potentially in a nonpartisan way in terms of what these regs actually mean with respect to what people are proposing?
Well, I'll start if I can. the big issue with National Pharmacare, the whole reason we're talking about it, is lots of folks or some folks don't have coverage or don't have adequate coverage. And whether that number is 1.8% or 20%, probably closer to 6 to 10%, those are the folks that need drug coverage and don't have it. And this, in my view, this whole PMPRB thing is not getting at the true issue, which is getting coverage to people that need it. That needs to be the focus on National Pharmacare. Lowering prices, all this money that's been spent on National Pharmacare, millions and millions of dollars, not one Canadian's gained coverage as part of that process. And think of all the people that could have coverage if the money was spent that way. So my advice is focus on getting people coverage, not on the grand schemes for through as part of the PMPRB process.
Neil, just a follow-on on that, and then we'll go to, is there still a role for the PMPRB in terms of a maximum ceiling price under which payers should work to get better prices?
Absolutely, there can be a role for the PMPRB, and as long as it's not working in duplication of what CADA and PCPA are doing, they need to find, make sure they're working harmoniously, not from what we see now, based on the regulation guidelines, the policies are going to be in conflict with each other, at least in terms of how they apply their particular policies.
Durhan?
Yeah, no, I agree very strongly. I mean, the challenge that we have right now with regard to linking National Pharmacare to PMPRB is that the impression is that the only way we can get National Pharmacare, and that means coverage for everybody, does not necessarily mean that we have one single Pharmacare program that is going to be applicable. We know that's not going to happen no matter what. But the myth that's been put forth is that's the only way that we're going to get, coverage for everybody, is by being able to impose these very strong restrictions up front in terms of the list price of drugs. And that is absolutely not the case. I mean, and, are we happy with the fact that we've got, a private plan and a public plan? That's a very different question than do we need to impose price controls that are based on. The basket of countries, quite frankly, does not bother me as much, though it will mean that if we're at the lower end of the OECD, we will be at the lower access. We know that. What does bother me is the pharmacoeconomic proposals there. And, when we ask them, who's going to do this? The answer is, well, we think that it will be done by, the existing agencies, the public agencies like CADA. So CADA has now got a double role. It's going to be playing at the front end in terms of setting the price. It's going to be playing at the back end in terms of the negotiated price, or is it just one, public review of the cost effectiveness that you're going to then push up front? It's very, very challenging to understand how this might actually work. And again, PMPRB has already stated we have no role in terms of looking at cost effectiveness per se, and yet they will be adopting all of this in terms of what we have seen. And what is very dangerous is right now what PMPRB does. They go and they say, Health Canada has approved this as a innovative therapy. Is it a superior therapy? And we're going to encourage, and it's now indicated for that. The PMPRB looks at the evidence and say, oh, no, we don't like that evidence. We don't think you're really superior. We think that, you are less than, or you're equivalent to the standard of care. So we're going to ask you, even though you are designated as, in fact, an innovative therapy, got through on a priority review, are addressing a need that's not being really met by anybody else, and are designated as an orphan drug and breakthrough therapy every place else. The PMPRB says, in their wisdom, using their own science advisors, we're going to ignore what Health Canada says. And I think that's already dangerous. So PMPRB claims that they're not going to be moving beyond their jurisdiction, but they're going to have to be if they're going to, one, decide what is in fact innovative or not, and then make the price of what categories. And secondly, if they're the ones who are going to be deciding which pharmacoeconomic analysis they're going to accept, what if there are differences, they're going to be the ones to choose. Quite frankly, that is way beyond what the system was set up to do. They're way beyond their jurisdiction, and it really will only then lead to even lower possibilities of drugs coming in that are innovative therapy. So yeah, the whole thing is very confusing, number one, because, I think it's confusing because it was never really designed to do what it is that they claim it's designed to do, and that is to keep prices from being excessive, but it was designed to serve the budgets and the payers to kind of keep drugs, either out of the system or to depress the prices in such a way that we're not going to even be able to get access to them. So, which is the same thing.
So I'll just add one thing to that, Durhan. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, when one of the key elements at the PMPRB when I was there, when they created guidelines, was to allow manufacturers to set prices they knew in advance would be non-excessive. And that's how the guidelines were set up. And you mentioned that the PMPRB 11 and expanding it, and industry's not happy with that, but at least they understand that, and they can do their calculations, and they can see go, no go. But if there's going to be a pharmacoeconomic price adjustment based on a CADIT recommendation in parallel with negotiations with PCPA, and the two are going to end up with different results, that's an uncertainty that manufacturers just cannot live with. And I think that's why you see so much pushback.
And can I just put in a quick plug before everybody goes? We are hosting a conference on the 18th and 19th, which will be on precision medicines and personalized healthcare. We think this is really important for us to be proactive in terms of moving the discussion forward, in terms of how we're going to actually get access to these within the realities of what we know is in Canada. But the most important thing we're calling for in this is a whole different way of doing business. We cannot enter into this era of precision medicines, personalized healthcare, if in fact we're doing it in conflict. If we've got payers and we've got providers on different sides, if we've got patients and we've got government systems on different sides, we are really calling for a new collaborative approach, really focused on how do we make these therapies, how do we make this new way of doing healthcare really accessible to everybody. And yes, at the end of the day, it's got to be affordable, but it's not going to be affordable in the way that the PMPRB is setting us up to be, and that is by just keeping the therapies out. We've got to work together. So we really encourage you to check on our website. We're hoping that people will, in fact, come and join us. And hopefully we can get some new dialogue that is not going to be just controlled by the government bodies.
Thanks, Durhan. And just to let people know, we've had some really good questions come in, but I just got them by email. There's been a problem with the GoToWebinar system, but we'll either get back to you offline, or if we can take a few extra minutes and go through a couple of them. Durhan, do you have a couple extra minutes to keep on going?
I have nothing but time.
Okay, good. Manufacturers have to factor in the cost of paying for private insurance and copay plans, and private insurers don't always pay more than public plans because of that copay cost. How does that copay at all weigh into this whole pricing scheme? Neil, this is a pretty particular question, but
sure. So if you think of, on average, the co-payments are about 20%. That's sort of a typical co-payment. And for drugs, for the more expensive drugs, the manufacturers typically cover the cost of those co-payments. So that's, that would be, as some would suggest, equivalent to a 20% rebate to the public plans where there is no significant co-pay or deductible in many cases. So that sort of comes under that whole heading of patient support programs. To what extent can manufacturers continue to do that if they're going to lose, if they're going to have their prices forced all the way down? And it brings up a whole separate issue about whether or not the confidentiality of those rebates being reported to PMPRB and how those affect follow-on medicines that are going to be tied to the rebated prices, the first ones. So there's all kinds of follow-on complexities and concerns that flow from all of that. But yeah, that's absolutely right.
We've got a couple questions on how a medicine will actually fall into the new economic factor review, and I mentioned it earlier. Two questions on the drug identification number. You're going to get a new drug identification number if you have a new dosage or a new formulation of something, and therefore, am I correct, Neil, in thinking that the economic factors could end up depressing a price significantly for a new type of an old medicine compared to the medicine that's currently marketed?
It's clearly something they haven't thought through, and what they're going to do with that. So, the easy one would be if there's a 5 and a 10 and a 20 milligram on the market, you're going to introduce a 40, and that the manufacturer knows there's going to be significant price reduction. Well, they just won't do it. But there's not a big impact on patients. Alternatively, there could be a new indication or which could be, for example, a pediatric dose, which comes later, and that pediatric dose is, half what the other one was, but will be forced, down to a fraction of that because of the new regulations and guidelines, and the manufacturers won't be willing to launch them. And that's a real problem they haven't thought through, and it's been brought up to PMPRB, and they said, oh, we'll deal with that through the guideline consultations, but that's a really important, potential problem.
So we've got 3 questions, and maybe this is over to you, Durhan, that relate to, okay, what can we do about this situation in the context of the coming weeks and months? One question said, is a die cast? Is this impossible to turn around? And maybe I'll review that one. These are regulations that are brought into effect in being by the cabinet, ministers, and really the executive of Canada that makes this determination. It's not a matter generally of Parliament or the legislature. So whatever happens on October 21st and the makeup of the next government, be it Liberal, a minority, or a minority Conservative, et cetera, the next cabinet that will be in place come November is going to have an opportunity potentially to re-review these regulations. So although they're there, they're not necessarily there forever. So the die is cast, they're de facto law, but the regulations can be changed. The next question, I'll turn this over to you, Durhan, and I think you were hinting at it with the plug for what you're doing in November, but how can patients and others engage and really make a difference on this in the context of either the election or the post-election environment? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely this is a difficult issue, right? And it's not something that is intuitive, for patients to understand or even for the public to understand. And I think that the problem is that, as much as we've been trying to do some of these webinars, et cetera, maybe our fault is that we have not broken this down into specific enough impacts that people can really appreciate it and understand it. And partly because some of it's hypothetical, what's going to happen into the future. So that's also a challenge. And I think we need to take then the action over that next 11 months. I mean, I hear your optimism, Bill, and maybe we can overturn these regulations. We were told at the steering committee over and over again, it doesn't matter what the regulations say, the real issue will be the guidelines. So fine, we need to take it upon ourselves to help develop these guidelines in a way that are going to be able to help us do the best we can, under what we've got is sort of a, impossible, overall, structures that are put in the place there. But the other thing we have to make sure we do, and it's kind of what we do already, and that is we need to be as much as possible reassuring to manufacturers that we can help in terms of, getting these products in, getting them fairly priced, getting them accessible to people. But that means that we really have to do a better job in terms of talking to patients and public and getting people really involved in it. Some of it goes back to, cases and being able to use those in terms of helping to draft guidelines. So yeah, I think over the next 11 months, we have to be very much involved in these guidelines. And yes, maybe we'll have an opportunity to overturn the regulations, especially the ones around the pharmacoeconomic factor. But let's not assume that that will happen, and let's see how we can make the best of getting, I think, guidelines that are not going to be, disenfranchising for manufacturers and really, harmful to patients.
If I could echo what Durhan's saying, the guidelines are the critical piece right now, and unless something happens, they're coming out in a couple of weeks. And what goes in the guidelines is decided by the board. There's the lawyers will say board qua board, the board operating as the board itself, the board members, and the board members. So not the board staff. The board staff make recommendations. They do all the analysis, but it's the 5 board members that make the decision as to what the guidelines are. And as part of the consultation process, there's going to be draft guidelines in a couple of weeks. There'll be some briefing sessions. There'll also be a policy forum. My understanding, they're going to be going across the country with the briefing sessions, and that there'll also be this policy forum. It's going to be really critical that patients hold the board to the to their word, that the opportunity is to get this right in the guidelines, and that they make sure they provide case studies, explain exactly how things are going to work, do the impact analysis using the data they already have rather than relying on sort of IQVIA data more broadly, but using the data they already have and actually push through some case studies and some impact analyses to really really demonstrate what the impact will be overall. And patients have a really important role in that in terms of making sure that PMPRB is clearly communicating what it is they're doing and how they're doing it.
I think that's probably a good spot to end it. There's one final question, mainly on logistics, and that's whether the deck will be shared, and it will go up on CORD's slide share network, and those of you who registered will certainly send you a link to where you can visit this webinar on YouTube and SlideShare. So I don't know, Durhan or Neil, do you have any final thoughts before we close the webinar?
No, just stay tuned. Lots more coming.
That was exactly my comment. We're going to need to do many more, I think, consultations and different forms of consultations. I think, and we need to be much more public in terms of what we're doing. So appreciate it so much in terms of the opportunity. And I echo the thanks Bill said in the beginning about NMR for hosting this for us and continuing to be such a great partner for us. We couldn't do it without you.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for logging in. Keep an eye out for those emails and stay tuned for other opportunities, webinars, and that conference that Durhan referenced in November. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.